I spent 2 years making a comic that no one will ever read. If you want to skip to the part about what I learned, links in the description below. Otherwise, stay tuned. So, back in 8th grade, I had this great idea for a comic. I was recently recovering from another graphic novel, and I had just finished watching some anime because I'm an otaku, and that's what we do in our spare time. Anyway, these anime, if you want to know, were ones like Tsutchie and Senkareya and a bunch of others. Okay, but here's the thing. What they all had in common was vampires, so I was like, okay, great, I totally want to make a comic about vampires now. And keep in mind, this was in a manga style. So I just kind of started drawing and made some covers, which I thought, hey, these look pretty good for an 8th grader. But I was pretty advanced in that time, honestly, though I still had a lot more to learn that I ended up learning the hard way because that's how things worked out. Anyway, time skip. So I drew around 40 to 50 pages and I was like, oof, these look like trash. They didn't, of course, but my story beginning had changed, so I decided to just start over again. A few weeks went by and I began what would take 2 years and ultimately would end up in over 200 pages of artwork that I personally drew by hand. All the characters, all the dialogue, all the frames, everything. Through my freshman and sophomore year, I cranked on this thing, and then one day I showed it to my dad and was like, hey dad, want to read this? Of course he was like, sure son. So he read it and then came to me later that day. All he really said was, yeah, so I couldn't figure out or understand what was going on the whole time, and so I lost track and I didn't even finish it. Well, and then my friend read it and he was like, yeah dude, I can't even finish this. The drawings are good, but like it's so confusing that I lost track and ultimately just gave up. Okay, so did you just tell me that I wasted the last 2 years on this comic? Like 250 pages. Each took me about 2 or 3 hours to draw. So that's like me wasting anywhere from 500 to 750 hours of my life on work no one cares about. Because they don't understand what's going on. You gotta be joking, right? No, they weren't joking, and as I look back, I can see why. Yeah, the drawings were good, but the story is so random and all over the place that people reading it are like, what? Literally the whole time. So, I kind of quit making comics after that, to be honest, but even though this experience was both degrading and emotionally wrecking, not to mention a huge waste of time, and an even bigger waster of talent that I could have been spending on something else, okay, maybe it wasn't that bad. But let's just put it this way. Let's face the facts. Despite what was said, it wasn't actually a huge waste of time. On the contrary, I learned quite a few things about comic making that I'll always have, and this is what they are. So, number one, when starting your comic, it's really important to approach it as much a writer as a comic artist. In other words, your comic is a story, and for that, the writing is really essential. The mistake I made was jumping into it and not thinking my story through before, but just while I was doing it. So I'd have this awesome idea that came out of nowhere, like, oh, let's have them go to a hot spring because that's so original. So I'd do that. Then have a great idea for a flashback. Then I'd have another idea, and you probably get the point by now. Basically, the reader doesn't get that. It's sporadic, it's all over the place. 1 minute your protagonist is here, then in the flashback, then there, and sooner or later, they're going to get really confused. So what you want to do is you want to look at your story or your movie in your head with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Sure, details are fine to add later, but the meat needs to be there. If you can do that, then you're on your way to a pretty successful story. And that brings me on to number 2. A comic is like storyboarding. It may seem obvious from just the look, but all the movies got to start with a series of picture sequences. Add words, and you basically have a comic. In other words, a comic looks a lot like a storyboard if you've ever seen one. So think about each page. each setup and each scene, which brings me to my next point. Number 3, your composition and your placement. So thinking over every page is crucial. How the character sits in the frame, the size of the panel, the shape of the panel, where the dialogue is, how it's broken up. All of these factors are essential. So have an idea of what you want to do. The best approach, I think, are to make the panels diverse. So you can have my main character, Takashi, sitting like this in one frame, then the camera angle moves over here, and boom, different view, same conversation. I got criticism in my comic for the repetitive use of talking heads in the frames, which is back and forth, talking with no visual diversity or interest to the reader. It's like if you watch a movie and, you know, this one person's like, oh my god, you're amazing, and then it switches to the other person and they're like, oh no, you're amazing, and then it just keeps switching back and forth, boom, 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 boom. You're like, after a while, you're like, when is the scene going to end? Because it's boring. It doesn't make any attempts to try to be interesting because they keep forcing the camera back and forth. It's like they have one camera and they're like, oh, we have to use it in the same way. But you don't. With comics, it's not that way. You can put the camera wherever you want. So if I were to sum it up, I'd say be diverse. Just be interesting in your frames and in your compositions. Number 4, dialoguing. So regardless of the complexity of your conversational scenes, it's really important to properly delineate dialogue in, honestly, just a really appropriate manner. I think most of you have probably heard of the show don't tell principle. In other words, this is the opposite of a novel. In pure writing, showing means dialogue, like characters having a conversation, and narration means telling, like just understanding what the situation is from whatever point of view is being told. But in comics, dialogue is the direct information. In other words, dialogue is more like the narration, and the showing part is like the dialogue of a novel, except it's in a comic form, so it's in drawings. This does depend on your personal style, but I do prefer if you have like a question and answer conversation that has a lot of different parts to it, like multiple questions and multiple answers, to stagger the speech bubbles so that they make sense in the order they're read, as well as when you have a huge chunk of dialogue. It really helps to break it up a little, just so the readers don't groan when they realize they have literally 100 words before they can flip the page. This does happen a lot, actually. One last note, just make sure the dialogue is natural. If you're revealing information, try not to spell it out right. Try to make it seem like it's more realistic. Make it creative and somehow fall into the natural flow of the character's words or their actions. Number 5, pacing. This is really one of the things that killed my comic. The pacing was all over the place. One minute they were being shot at, the next minute he was falling asleep at his desk in school during class. This not only is super random and not very sensible, it also screws with the audience's sense of immersion in the story. So just try to make the events the right pace for the story, and from that you can just usually tell when that is depending on the plot. So I hope this video gives you a few things to think about, and possibly helps with your comics, your manga, your graphic novels, your writing, if you're making movies, anything really. As always, like and subscribe for more content, and thanks so much for watching.